So guys, this is a quick video showing the impact of Trafalgar in a practical and tangible way. I think I've already covered this topic enough, but no matter how many times I repeat the same thing about how if you just run the numbers on how much 10% evasion rate increases your damage by, you'll understand why she's so good. And there are still people who just can't really make sense of it for one reason or another. All of that ends today. What I've done is create a control fleet around Trafalgar and the other ships I'm comparing her to, and noting down how the damage changes with each Vanguard ship. For the control fleet, I'm using a typical, relatively consistent main fleet of Lion, Mecklenburg, and Bismarck's Way, avoiding carriers so they don't randomly get spotted in a run and mess up the results. In the Vanguard, I also have Eldritch Retrofit, who will make sure that the Vanguard ship I'm testing will not die under any circumstance, and whose slow will also aid in consistency from run to run. The ships that I put Trafalgar up against are Plymouth, Z-52, Hindenburg, and Helena. All ships that probably no one will dispute are among the strongest against medium armor in terms of damage contribution through their own damage, combined with the buffs and debuffs they provide. The full footage of runs, including all the equipment I used, will be linked in the description. I changed nothing about the control fleet from test to test, except I moved Mecklenburg to the flagship for Plymouth, so that the highest damaging ship would make most use out of Plymouth's buff. And I also moved Bismarck's Way to the top position for Z-52's runs, since she fires first, in order to activate Z-52's debuff. For the other runs with Trafalgar, Hindenburg, and Helena, Bismarck was the flagship to trigger Eldritch's slow. One may point out that by putting Mecklenburg as the flagship in Plymouth's run, Bismarck's salvos will not fully benefit from Eldritch's slow. However, that is a trade-off you have to consider in a lot of real scenarios too, whether you want to put your strongest damaging ship in the flagship to benefit more from Plymouth's damage buff, or put the ship that fires first as the flagship to activate the other buffs first. Very rarely will the most damaging ship also be the first to fire, as they will want to be the beneficiary of the buffs that are activated by other ships firing before them. The same considerations apply when you're using Z-52 and Eldritch, or Trafalgar together. Now, while all of these Vanguards would be capable of killing Yorktown meta in a full fleet, I didn't put any ships with summons in the Vanguard because I actually want to actively avoid killing the boss, as the damage difference would be lost to overkill and there would be no point. By consistently doing less than 1.5 mil, we can actually see how much the final damage is changed by the choice of Vanguards. Keep in mind that what I want to show is which Vanguard would provide the most damage, so while yes, Z-52 and Plymouth are much tankier, I'm only interested in the damage part. Survivability is a whole other topic. I only did 5 runs each as the damage was quite consistent from run to run outside of Helena. And I recorded the total damage of the fleet, which we'll be analyzing, as well as the test ship's individual damage as shown on the end screen. But that number is essentially useless, as we want to know the effect of the buffs and debuffs of the ships as well, plus the fact that there are planes in the fight, making it look like Z-52 dealt way more damage than Hindenburg, when it's very obvious that Hindenburg's damage against the actual boss would have been much higher. Looking at the results, as expected, Helena resulted in the highest average damage dealt by the fleet, with Trafalgar coming in second place. The effect size was quite small, but you have to keep in mind that these are literally all among the strongest Vanguards in the game, and it's only a single ship out of a fleet of 5, so each individual ship's impact will be diluted by the output of all the other ships. Aside from the fact that Trafalgar beat out Plymouth, Z-52, and Hindenburg, we also have data about how the other 3 ships compare to each other, although I would prefer more samples to back up the statements I'm about to make. First, despite dealing by far the highest personal damage, Hindenburg contributed the least amount of damage, and it would have been even lower, relatively speaking, in a full fleet. I do feel that recently, there has been a ton of main fleet power creep between the LA9s, Lion, Mecklenburg, Hakuho, and so on, compared to the main fleets that were available when Hindenburg was at her strongest. So Vanguard buffers are now performing at a higher level than damage dealers. This is reflected by how many evasion rate debuffers, Z-52s, and Eldritches we've been seeing in the recent meta fights, as opposed to Hindenburgs or Unzens. I think there will be some major shifts in my Vanguard tier list soon to reflect these changes, likely shifting damage dealers down a bit relative to buffers, but the update coming tomorrow contains quite a lot of major additions in the Gear Lab, as well as Chapter 14 Hard, so it might take a few days until I get around to it. Next, even though Plymouth appears to have edged out Z52 slightly, Z52's debuff affects the entire fleet and would contribute more in a full fleet as opposed to a fleet of 5 ships. This also applies to Trafalgar's debuff. Additionally, Z52 and Trafalgar's debuffs also contribute toward carrier damage, so if you're running carrier-centric fleets like Soyuz, Nakhimov, Fritz Rume, or Kearsarge, Yorktown, and Fritz Rume, then Z52 and Trafalgar will provide much bigger benefits than Plymouth, especially with Soyuz, since Soyuz herself is the lowest damaging ship in the main fleet when used as a carrier buffer. These results align with what I said about Z52 originally, that she was approximately tied with or slightly stronger than Plymouth against medium armor, better against heavy, and worse against light. I'll also address the elephant in the room now, which is Helena. And yes, Helena with good sync will actually contribute the most damage on average. However, depending on how much damage your fleet already deals without her, that extra damage could just be overkill at the cost of consistency, which is why people opt to drop her as soon as possible. If you're consistently short of killing the boss, Helena remains the premier option for increasing your damage ceiling. 5 runs is very little to show Helena's true performance, and looking at the results, in true Helena fashion, she started off her runs with 3 of the highest damaging runs across all of the samples, and then after 2 more runs, she also managed to cause the lowest damage run. That's enough about Helena, we all know how she is. Finally, I also want to point out how the test was even biased against Trafalgar in a couple of ways. First, I used the Bismarck's Way, who is not one of the best possible options against this boss, and she grants a firepower buff only to Z52 and Hindenburg, but not to Plymouth or Trafalgar. Trafalgar also grants firepower to Lion, which can be viewed as a similarly biased way to increase her contribution, but it's Lion, who is the strongest or close to strongest against pretty much every boss, so Trafalgar's faction buff increasing Lion's damage further should be the expectation. Second, I gave all the Vanguards 1 offensive auxiliary, but Trafalgar benefits the least from it, having the lowest personal damage and most powerful debuff. In a lot of more challenging fights, it could be the case that the ships have to bring 2 defensive auxiliaries, in which case Trafalgar would be even more favored, although the other way can also be argued that there are enough fights where you could afford to get away with double damage auxiliaries on at least Plymouth and Z52. Alright, I think that should be enough to settle this question. If you still don't believe me, or think the sample size isn't sufficient to prove anything, the beauty is that you can set up the exact same experiment and see the results for yourself. And for those who understood how good Trafalgar was in the first place and watched the video all the way through, sorry for wasting your time. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.